times in India particularly, we have seen that there has been quite a burgeoning of culture that has come from the margins, or what were seen as the margins. And so there is a space now, but that space has been hard won. It's not something that has emerged naturally. It has been fought for, and people have been persistently demanding to be heard. And but I think now for young writers, definitely there is. I wouldn't say that it is an easy time, but it is an easier time than it was, let's say, 25, 30 years ago. So I'd like to start actually by asking both of you how you see yourself, in a generational sense, right? So of course you occupy very different cultural contexts. Aditya lives in India, Afshan lives in the UK. But I think also because of globalization, there is a greater conversation across borders as well in the queer community. So if you can start by talking a little bit about how you see yourself within the larger literary landscape, and what sort of struggles, if any, you have had to find a space and a voice there. So we'll start with Aditya and then over.
So hi everybody. Am I audible enough? Okay. So I do agree with what you said, Usha. That of course, I think the broader notion that people have about queer people or queer writers or the community is that we're a monolith, and we are not. And I think with this book also, that is something I tried to reflect by capturing the intersectionality that exists within the movement, and talking about finding my space as a queer writer, queer poet in India or otherwise. As I wouldn't say, I mean, as of course we live in a very different time now than 25 years ago. So of course it's not been very elusive, but it's not been easy at the same time. So like for example, like I started writing in 2017. I had an year before that I had gone to New York to do hotel management. So I wanted to be a chef. I never wanted to be a writer. But I came back and then I remember started reading poetry, and then I just got immersed into poetry, and then I started writing poetry eventually. But the publishing again was very difficult because there was a platform that used to exist at that point called Tumblr. So I used to write on that, and then a friend of mine saw it and said, "Oh, why don't you turn all this into a book?" And I was just gobsmacked because I was like, okay, I've never imagined or envisioned myself as a writer, poet, or somebody who's got a book. Then it happened, but of course I did not get a very good response from the publishers in India, because I feel like now in India today, even the publishing is a lot about number game also. How who knows who and how many followers do you have, etc., etc. So yeah, I think in a nutshell that has been my experience. But I think in the queer movement, I think as a writer in the future, I think I see myself making more contributions of nuanced experiences and voices. I think that's where I see myself somewhere along the line.
I think for myself, I started writing as a way to process my emotions and understand my own identity. I think a lot of writers begin as a form of therapy, as a form of just trying to process. And I started writing versions of poetry. They were really bad poems when I was like 9, 10 years old, and sort of put them aside. I started writing plays, performance. I wrote a novel when I was 16, and I think I came out at the same time that I really wanted to explore writing. So for me, the idea of being queer and the idea of writing felt quite intertwined. I was exploring a lot of queer ideas within my work without understanding that's what it was. And I think when I came out, there wasn't, 15, 16 years ago, there weren't very many A, South Asian queer people in the UK, and then B, Muslim queer people in the UK or anywhere. There was maybe like 1 or 2 people that I could really look to as an understanding of A, what does that mean to be queer and Muslim and hold those 2 identities? And then what does it mean to be a writer that explores multiple or all of those identities within my work? And I think throughout the course of my writing over the past, particularly the last 5 or 6 years, it's been a lot more queer writers, a lot more South Asian queer writers, a lot more Muslim queer writers that have sort of been platformed, and I've been really grateful to be in conversation with them, because it allows me to interrogate my own work and my own perspectives. And like Aditya says, I don't want there to be a monolith. It's not that there's only one particular perspective to what it means to be queer and or Muslim and or South Asian, and be a writer within it. My mum asked me, as a lot of mothers do, like, do you need to tell people about who you are? Can you not just be? And my answer to that, and 10 years ago, and it still exists now for me, is that if one person can read my work and feel seen within their work, then I've done my job. And I guess in terms of like where I see myself generationally, I think I'm writing for those people, because I didn't have that when I was younger, when I was coming out. I was on the internet, on Tumblr, on various forums, and I couldn't find anything that could allow me to exist in my body, in my person. And so I think I'm writing for that child, but I'm writing for the younger people now that are coming up that just require just a moment to be seen, I think. I hope.
I'd just like to add, I think I agree with what Afshan is saying, and I think for me as well, I think growing up gay and in Jabalpur, in a non-metro, place, I think that is also something I wanted to see. I think for the longest time, I wanted to see somebody like me, looks like me, speaks like me, has narratives like me, and I didn't find it. So I got into poetry, and then of course, very much like Afshan, even my initial poems are very bad, I think, when I read them now. But I think last couple of years, I think my work is taking its shape. So yeah.
Yeah. Hello, can you hear me? Yes? Speak louder. No, now I can hear myself. So actually something both of you touched on, which is the fact that you begin writing to explore your own identity, to find ways to talk about how you feel, how you see yourself, how you think about your body and your mind. But then the act of writing actually goes beyond that, right? And as Afshan said, it then becomes about representing yourself for the other. And as happens with a lot of writers from marginalized communities or communities that don't see themselves represented very much, it's as much about yourself as about building community, creating visibility. And I think through your work, in different ways, you've actually, and in what you said just now, you're also signaling that there could be a community. And I'm wondering how your writing has built that community for yourselves. Has that been a way through which you've actually built that community for yourselves and made it possible for others to find community?
So should I start? Okay. No, so I think for me, poetry helped me kind of battle my own feelings and kind of help me understand my own feelings. But then I eventually, over the years, got into journalistic writing. So like I've contributed to several publications in India and in the UK. And for me, it just happened suddenly because I was seeing all these perspectives around me, all these stories around me, of communities within communities that are often not seen or heard. And I thought, okay, the mainstream media is probably not going to do its job. So I wanted to be in a space where I and many people like me come forward and tell our own stories. Because I think when we do that, there's less fear of being misquoted or misheard or unseen. So I tried to do that with my journalistic writing, and I think some of the most incredible stories I found were in my own neighborhood. But nobody sees it, nobody talks about it. So I think that is why, I think that is how I kind of created that space through journalistic writing. But with creative writing, with my poetry, I've had so many young people even reading it today. So like I, for example, have young people reaching out to me today, telling me about the book I published in 2019, this book of poems. And they love it. And I'm like, but I don't love it anymore. So what do you love about it? Because it was written by a 19, 20-year-old person who just wanted to be seen. That was my whole motive of getting into poetry. It wasn't about creating art or, changing the world or anything. It was just wanting to be seen. And I think sometimes that is what writing does. I think writing in its own way is activism, right? When queer and trans people kind of do that. So I think for me that happened through my both creative writing and journalistic writing.
I think I've been quite privileged in my upbringing in that my dad is, he speaks Urdu and he's a poet, as a lot of men my dad's generation are. So I grew up going to mushairas and going to poetry evenings and sometimes just going to dinners, and suddenly somebody will start a poem and then somebody else will do another shire and then a ghazal will come out and then it will, 3 hours later you're like, okay, can we move on now? I'm bored. And so I understood this idea of like poetry and community was very key to performance. And then sort of entering the writing industry myself, I found that the idea of writing is a very individual and intimate and quite a lonely experience. And I wanted to replicate the idea of community. So about 12 years back, I started a young queer group called Young Enigma in Manchester in the UK. And that was a way to bring in writers under the age of 35 that identified as queer, so LGBT+. And initially we tried to get funding, we ran writing workshops, and it was a way that I could build my network, but also that we could share experiences and share ideas and access, more importantly, funding, so that we could take our work on tour and develop our craft. I'm quite lucky, or maybe, I don't know, unlucky in that most of my friends, all of my friends are writers. So we can, that is my community, 90% of them are queer. I don't know if that's by choice or just because we're all insane and insane people just attract other insane people. But it's a new way of us being able to sort of get feedback off of each other and create a network of support as well for each other. For me, there's a desire that I have in every place I work, whether it's a writing organisation or not, that I want to be able to platform and represent queer writers and bring in more queer writers. And so that first network of people, the communities through spoken word, through publishing, becomes my first point of call to then try and invite into those spaces.
My mic doesn't like me, I think. I mean, this brings me to another question that is more about craft and about the life of a writer, right? So when you position yourself or even see yourself as writing against the mainstream or writing to create community, in some senses what is foregrounded is the activism. I mean, even if you don't see it as activism, it is a kind of activism. And for a writer to also be an activist is, I mean, of course it is generative, but it also takes away from the spaces of solitude and quiet that you need to create. And I'm wondering how you balance that in your lives as writers or as representatives of queer fiction or queer poetry or queer literature. Yeah.
I mean, we just heard the personal is political, right? And I feel that my identity in the multiple forms is very political. The fact that I even exist and I'm breathing right now is a political act. That is activism in itself. So, and it's very tiring. And the idea of like balancing my activism and organizing with my writing is an ongoing battle. Sometimes I do it well, sometimes I do it very badly. And then on top of that, I have to live and make money and pay my bills. So then it's trying to find a job that pays all of that. And I don't know how it works in India, but to be a poet in the UK, you don't make a lot of money.
Even in India, you don't make money, and on top of that, just to add, there's so much ostracization also that we experience on top of everything.
You mean as writers or as queer people?
Both. I think both.
So it's a double marginalization.
100%.
Yeah.
I think in terms of like activism, I couldn't not be an activist. I couldn't not bring in other people into it. I couldn't not support and mentor and create organizations or spaces for other queer people or marginalized people to exist within it. And my writing, I think, tries to do a little bit of that. It's building the spaces that I didn't see exist when I was a child. So it will always be a part of my my work.
I think that is what queer poetry kind of did that for me, because I mean, I was of course bullied my entire school life, so I had no friends. Started writing poetry, then eventually got to meet so many amazing writers and poets who kind of, I mean, of course, they don't help you get published, which is the larger notion. People think if you know some famous writer, they'll help you publish. That doesn't happen, unfortunately. But they do give you good feedback. So I think I have been very fortunate to kind of be friends or know some of the most amazing, prolific queer writers and poets have come before me and have paved the way for young people like me. And I mean, I hope I get to do the same when I'm, what, 76 and glamorous.
Like Hoshan,
Yeah, like Coach.
yeah, whom you've written about in your book. So maybe we can take a short break and read from some of your work. So Afshan, would you like to start, and then we'll move on to Aditya.
I was supposed to prep what I was going to read and I didn't. But
I did give you that homework.
You did, and I completely slipped my mind. I think the part I'm going to read from is we were having a conversation earlier about language and generation in terms of like what generation I would count myself in the UK. So you have first generation, so people that moved to the UK, and then you have second generation or another country, second generation migrants who parent moved to the country and then they were born there. And I moved to the UK before I was 7, so I technically count as 1.5 generation. I'm claiming it, it's fine. And so this piece is called 1.5, and it goes like this. 1.1. Last night I cried. My father came home and told me an uncle had shouted at him for letting his daughter wear short dresses. I cried not because of the inherent sexism or the male gaze that will never let up in our community, but because when I imagined having a conversation with this uncle in Urdu, I couldn't. I got halfway through telling him what respect really meant when I forgot the word for gaze, and I couldn't come up with an equivalent in Hindi and Urdu, and my mother tongue, it bit itself. I'm able to engage and interrogate certain ideas in English, but my basic words and emotions are still stuck in my mother tongue, and I cried because even in my fantasies, I couldn't win an argument against one of my sexist uncles. 1.2. It's been too long since I stood side by side with my mother in the kitchen to cook, scribbling down recipes for dishes to remember them for when I'm older. She switches them up when she tells them to me, adds extra tomatoes and yogurt and halves of spices because she knows something that I don't. The more years I spend apart from her, the less spice my tongue will be able to hold. As desi words vanish, as desi words no longer fill my mouth, so will desi taste vanish from my palate. I plate my food now with extra spices, an attempt to try and get used to the feeling of mirch and pain on my tongue, a feeling that will grow to become more familiar as I move closer and closer to 1.3. My body is one with the beats of the tabla, but my ears can no longer take the high-pitched tones of the singers. The surah stops at me. Sa, re, ga, ma, ba, da, ni, sa came before do, re, mi, but I only know the rags that feature in the top 10. I've listened to remixes of remixes until all I can hear are the DJ, Vale Babu Mera Gana Chalata. And I still rejoice when I hear Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan's Janiya, and it sends shivers down my spine. And I start the song again, my lips opening as if Nusrat's voice is my own, but even with his voice guiding mine, I miss the beat and start the next line too early, and my body moves a half a beat off the tabla, and I pretend that I'm listening in double time. 1.4 women do not fit into saris. Saris are made for whole women, 1.0 women. For those of us that are 1.4 women, the yards don't stretch enough to make the right amount of pleats to fall and brace our curves when we walk. The gap between our blouses and our skirts is bigger than the space between the ground and our folds, but not greater than the rift between our histories and us. 1.4 of us won't remember to bind the pallu before we count the pleats. We will fold a threaded sari in on itself and buy sari-inspired jackets with labels that cost us more than a flight ticket back home. I buy my bangles from Amazon because I'm too ashamed to walk into the high street shop, ask the uncle for Julian, pronounce it wrong. My wrists may have been made for the constant clanging of glass against glass, but smashing the patriarchy makes me bleed, and I bleed vermilion, sindoor, a concept I'm familiar with not from my relatives, but from daily cliffhangers, from dramas on ZTV and Sony. My sari threatens to undo itself and expose my pale skin. 1.5 generation immigrant. I'm not wholly second generation, assimilated, somewhat accepted into a community. I'm too young when you came here to be first generation, but still foreign enough to have a home to go back to. I'm not enough. 0.5 of me is stuck in another country constantly. 0.5 of me is struggling to turn my tongue in ways I used to. 0.5 of me cries at the thought of my children not being able to hold private conversations in public. 0.5 of me cannot hold a dupatta straight. 0.5 of me forgets if the song was an original or remix. Point 5 of me will never remember what channel Kyunki Saas Bhi Kabhi Bahu Thi came on. Point 5 of me turns to the whole of me and questions her identity. 1.5 of me sits on the borders and laughs back. 1 foot in each country, weight distributed so not to weigh anyone down. I take your spices and mother tongue and sequins and rags, and I raise you as a proud immigrant. Thank you.
I don't know how I will match that. Very beautiful. I will be reading the preface from my new book that came out last year. There were a lot of things that were ricocheting around in my head while I was thinking of even putting down this book together, and I think my preface would kind of try to explain some parts of it. Um, so I grew up gay in Jabalpur, a small city in Madhya Pradesh. In Jabalpur, you couldn't be openly gay. So as a teenager, there weren't enough people around me on whose shade I could take shelter. We all need people to look up to after all, whether we are young or old, male or female, binary or transgender, straight, bisexual or gay. As a child, I was told I was a lot of things, and successful wasn't one of them, nor there were voices like mine being represented in mainstream media. There are many like me in India and around the world, and we all feel like we never belonged anywhere. I longed to see someone from a smaller city like mine to show up in the mainstream, someone who could represent me. This is what led me to become a writer, publishing my first book of poems and now this anthology. And in this anthology, I have told the stories of 19 trailblazers of our country's LGBTQ plus movement, many of whom are well known, but many who might be new to you. Some come from poorest villages, others from prosperous upper middle class families. Some have had an education, and many have had to drop out of school due to the pressures they have faced. Some are gay, some transgender, but they all have one thing in common: the battles they have faced and won, both socially and humanly, are immense. Their courage is extraordinary. Each has made India an easier and a better place for the next generation of the LGBTQ plus community. The history of India's LGBTQ plus community isn't synonymous with the one in the West. While we must never forget trailblazers like Marsha P. Johnson or Sylvia Rivera, so these were the activists who started the Stonewall riots, the whole movement. So while we must never forget trailblazers like Marsha P. Johnson or Sylvia Rivera during Pride Month, in India we must also acknowledge the ferocity of those numerous hijras and kotis who have been at the forefront of the movement for centuries. It is also important to mention the intersectionality of caste and class, which has made all our heroes' journeys even more challenging. The pride flag alone is insufficient to make one whole sari for a hijra who has to clap and strip naked on the streets to protect herself. And in this book, I have tried to create a list that reflects these complexities. The idea of icons through a queer lens will never ever be complete. We are all heroes, trendsetters, and inspirations in our lives in our own ways. Coming down to just 19 names was the most difficult part of this project. Even then, I have missed out on countless names of queer individuals and collectives who continue to resist systemic oppression, especially the ones who have been visible and not seen by society and media. And for that, I would like to apologize to the community at large. And to my fellow queer friends, I hope that when you hold this book in your hands, you cherish the lives of those people who also think of those countless voices who will never be seen or heard, but continue to live and leave behind their impact, even if it may not be felt widely. To our heterosexual counterparts, when you hold this book in your hands, ask yourself if you've made even a slight difference in the world. to make it a bit more loving. If you don't have an answer, recess why, and that is the day when the real work begins. Today, as I sit down to put this book together with a strong sense of freedom and pride, it is because of the lives of various others who have come before me. They have opened colossal doors for people like me in Jabalpur, Raipur, Rampur, or Bilaspur that didn't exist many years ago. And then I'm ending my preface with a note on the marriage equality verdict itself. That at a time like this, when we are amid a monumental hearing on marriage equality in India, whatever the judgment might be, I believe it was a moment to celebrate our journey. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for those readings, which kind of brings me to the last set of questions that I have before we turn it over to the audience, which has to do with intersectionality. And I know that both of you refer to it in multiple ways, but I think the peculiar or particular intersections that one needs to deal with or make visible, let's say in a diasporic context, which you did in your poem, but I think your poem is much more about individual experience as a diasporic citizen compared to how, let's say, the world sees you, and also the struggle to be seen as multiple, right? Versus someone like Aditya, who I think one of the primary things, Aditya, about your narrative is that it comes from small town India. And of course, Jabalpur is not really small town, but it's still not a...
Bigger than some parts in England.
Yes. But I think there's a sensibility that you have to struggle against in a town like Jabalpur, apart from the fact that it's also in India's heartland, right? With all the politics that symbolizes. So what kind of intersections do you think have been particularly either strengthening or problematic in both cases? Because I think this also has implications for how we build community. So if LGBTQI plus is the central identity that they claim to, but it can never be the only identity, right? I mean, it's one of multiple identities. So how do you choose then to form allyships? How do you extend that community, keeping intersectionality in mind? Maybe it's a very complicated question, but yeah, take it from wherever you want.
Yeah, I can go. So I what I call a part-time hijabi. So I wore a headscarf from the age of 6 for my own choice. I fought with my mom; she didn't want me to, and then I wore it on and off until about 5 years ago. And part of wearing a hijab and identifying myself as Muslim very publicly in the UK and in India, I find it's very similar in terms of like religion and how Islam is seen right now. It felt very political, and I felt like in order for me to walk into queer spaces, I had to like be extreme gay, extreme queer, to be like, no, I'm not a threat. I'm not one of those Muslims. I'm not going to do X, Y, and Z. So, one of my poems that I might read later on in one of the forums is about me wearing a pride flag with me as I'm wearing a hijab to identify myself as queer, so that when I walk into spaces, people don't freak out. And that's something that I shouldn't have to do. And it's something that nobody should have to do, is have to identify themselves in very particular ways. But it was a safety mechanism, because I knew that wearing a hijab or identifying myself as Muslim in those spaces was going to be that they didn't want to engage with me. And in fact, we had a lot of protests in the UK, in Birmingham particularly, around schools, around queer education and books by trans authors. And there were a lot of protests by the local community, who are predominantly South Asian, majority Muslim. And there was a lot of backlash from the queer community, sort of pointing fingers to Muslims, being like, well, you're homophobic and you're this. And I was like, okay, cool, but like if I walk into a queer space, the queer spaces are very Islamophobic and very white and quite racist. So it feels like I'm stuck on either end of like, I'm not queer enough, or I'm too queer, or I'm not Muslim enough, or I'm too Muslim. And so for me, there's a constant battle of like, when do I out myself in a certain space? When do I out myself as queer? When do I out myself as Muslim? And I know that the body that I inhabit and the clothes that I wear there's a certain privilege to that. It's weird because my photo for this event is from a few years back, and I've lost quite a bit of weight since then. So people have really struggled to see me as me. But the privilege that that comes with, being in a bigger body versus being in a smaller body, I'm noticing it. And like even that as an aspect we don't talk about in society. So, that added into the fact that I'm a hijabi or a Muslim or identifying as South Asian or queer, or, I'm wearing gold or I've got longer nails. What do all those things, how do people respond to that in society? And it all changes. And I think there's something that we talk about in some ways, in terms of like being feminine or being masculine or presenting, but we don't really interrogate what that means as a society, how we enact towards those people and how we are nicer to people that come across as Western in some spaces, or are slimmer or lighter skinned, or straight, I guess as well.
Yeah. Before I move on to Aditya, just to emphasize one of the points you made about we often don't interrogate the response. We're always thinking about the presentation, and I think that's something we really need to think about more, no matter which side of the debate you're on. Aditya.
So with me, I think I used to kind of, so for me, it's been a very, very complex journey. First, it was about finding an identity, and then it was letting all of it go. Um, so I think I always say this to a lot of young people also, that I think as queer people, queer writers, we have lived many lives. And I personally have been at the receiving end of many things. Even like there are things within the community, right? Like there are so many intersections that exist even within the community. How sometimes it becomes really difficult because you are like, actually, if I do this, I am wrong. If I do this, then I'm wrong. So where am I right actually? But I remember this incident, this memory from when I was younger. When I was in the 8th or 9th class, and I had found this gay park in my city, which of course gay parks was a culture that existed for many years across South Asia. I think still does somewhere, some places. But I remember I used to go to these parks wearing heels and white eyeliner and nail paint and this and that, and all the gays used to run from the back door. They all used to run. It was pre 377, and they used to run and they used to say, "We don't want to be seen with this person because otherwise everybody will know we are also gay." And they were like, they used to tell me this one thing. They used to say, anybody can look at you and tell you are gay. And I used to disagree growing up. But eventually I had to surrender to it because, yes, I am. But then, of course, there are so many things and intersections that make our identity. So I always tell people that don't restrict me, that I can be gay and I can be an intellectual also. I can be gay and I can be a journalist also, or a writer also. So I think over the years I had to kind of fundamentally undo these structures both in my own self and around myself to kind of find and build my voice. So yeah, I think in a nutshell, if that answers your question. But thanks for throwing such a complex question at me.
Yeah, I clearly a question like that can have a panel for itself. But I realize we're at the 10-minute mark, so I will give some space to audience questions. We have a small but intimate audience, and maybe there will be some questions. Otherwise, I can go on. Would you like to hear them read a little more? Yeah? Anuja. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
All right, so my question is, I think one thing we could all relate with when you spoke, there was the push and pull inside us, the equal but opposing impulses. So, could you give us some insight into how you can deal with it in a manner that's relatively healthy?
See, if I want to talk like some guru, I would say surrender. Right? It's easier said than done. You can say surrender, but that surrender has its own surrendering because it's a process of its own. So I think I would say just let it be there and, kind of find your way, slowly navigate through it. And I feel like I have understood this over the years that not everything I have to fight in my life. Sometimes I just have to let things be. let things exist. I can coexist with them. So sometimes they bother you, sometimes they don't bother you. But so ignore all that. But like a true guru, surrender.
I think there's a misconception when we talk about balance that means that we have to be 50-50 100% of the time. And I don't think it works like that. I think it is like I see my life as phases. I see my year as phases. I see my month and my week as a phase. And there'll be certain times when I'll be overworking and certain times when I will do nothing. My door is closed, my Netflix is on, I don't have any socialization, no meetings, my Uber or Zomato deliveries are coming in through the door, that's it, right? And that's how I balance. So it's not that I'm balancing 100% of the time. If you were to meet me on one of those days when I'm bed rotting, doing nothing, you'll be like, what the heck is this person doing? How does she survive? Or you see me on my day when I'm like, high on work, working from 6 a.m. till 11 p.m., you'll be like, how does she function? Is it drugs? What's going on? So there's, and I think that's how it works with life. I think you just have to recognize and work with your body. And I think there's a gendered perspective to it as well. I think the world is quite patriarchal in that we use a 24-hour cycle. And I think for some of us that are in feminine bodies, that our cycle doesn't work like that. We have a 28-day cycle, and actually we should be looking very much at the phases of our month and then working out what is the best phase to be creative, to be angry, to be an activist, for me to bed rot, and what is the time that I should go to the gym, because not 28 days of that cycle I will have the mindset or my body will be in a great position to do it. So I think it all works in together, and I think surrendering and listening to our bodies and ourselves is the most important. But I think balance it's a lie. It's never 50-50 the whole way through. It's 100% and then 0 and then 70% and 30%, and it's a continuous cycle.
I think embracing is really important, and I think sometimes just doing nothing is also very liberating. So so yeah, I think embracing whatever, I think listening, developing that, reaching a place in your life where you listen to your intuition or surrender to your intuition. I think that is what we must practice. I think I've done that many times, and I've effed over myself many times also, thinking, oh, my intuition was right about this. But yeah, so I mean, it's okay. I think it's about embracing everything and not feeling guilty about it.
Just to add to that, and of course not to take away from the main panelists, but I think the point of intersectionality is that we allow ourselves to be multiple, and that multiplicity doesn't need to exist at one time, right? I mean, so I might respond as on the basis of my queer, as Afshan so beautifully said, on the basis of my sexuality at one point, but on the basis of my gender at another point, on the basis of my politics at another point. And that's how we live life. So I think, this idea of intersectionality has actually forced us to think about ourselves as sectioned beings. But the point of it is to think of ourselves as multiple rather than sectioned, if that makes sense. Any other questions?
So earlier you mentioned that being queer in and of itself is a statement, and both of you have written books that are representation. How do you feel about the idea that writing should be political?
I think it goes down to why you write and what is that urge within us. I think writing is political. Whether it should or shouldn't, I think is a non-question. It is political just by nature. If I, as a Muslim, South Asian, queer person, decides to write about bananas in the UK, that's a political act, because I'm not writing about my identity, and I don't have the privilege and the space to be able to just write about bananas, right? If I decide to write about my queer identity, that's a political conversation. I think you can make anything political. Everything that is writing, that is about interrogating, that is about making us better or feel something, is a political act for me. Loving, I think, is a political act. To fall in love, to be in love, to continue to be in love, given the society that we're in right now, is political. I think everything just is. The way the stage is right now is political. How we're sat right now is political. The clothes I've got watermelons on I don't know, it feels very political.
I'm dressed up as a leopard.
As a leopard, there we go. So there's, do you know what I mean? Everything is and isn't political at the same time. And I think writing is one of those things that is always political. I think we lie to ourselves by saying that, oh, it's just a children's book, or it's just a poem, or it's just this. It's never just something. It's always doing something.
Shana's just put it very beautifully, but I think just to add one line, that when we try to defy what the systems ask us to do or try to put us into, I think that itself is a big political proclamation. But as you had mentioned it earlier, that existing for people like us is a big political proclamation, because we're against or in opposition to everything, religion, system, government, everything that's trying to oppress us or oppose us. So yeah, I think she's put it very beautifully, and I think I would not like to add more to it.
This is a piece that I wrote for a newspaper a few years back, and it's called "Love as a Form of Protest." And it's sort of a little bit about your question about, you know, political and activism and everything that we've talked about today. As a South Asian girl who's grown up Muslim, I was always curious about love. I was brought up on love. I loved the idea of falling in love. South Asian poets taught me about the kind of love that was expressed in palm trees and mangoes. Drunk on the honey of mango blossom, the coal rapturously kisses his mate. Bollywood films taught me that love and desire could only be portrayed by two flowers lightly brushing up against each other in the wind, followed by high-pitched singing and heavy tabla beats. And my mother taught me about unconditional love, that expectations can lead to disappointments. So it's better to love fully and love properly and to never expect anything back. Why should we live in disappointment when we can live in love? But it took me coming out and becoming visibly queer and Muslim to understand that love, for me, is a political act. No matter who I fall in love with, someone somewhere always has something to say. If I fall in love with a woman, I'm gay. If I fall in love with a man, I'm straight. If I fall in love with someone who's not Asian, then I'm a traitor. If I fall in love with someone who is Asian, I'm a stereotype. I'm seen as a submissive Muslim girl devoid of sexuality while simultaneously being hypersexualized by the media. I cannot just fall in love. I'm a queer Muslim who has had to justify her own existence and am forced to do the same to others every single day. Just as I cannot simply fall in love, I cannot find love easily. Even when I manage to step away and not care about the identity labels people give me, there are other considerations I have to make, and other questions I have to ask. Will the woman I love be content with not holding my hand in public because I'm scared of being beaten up by homophobes? Will the man I love stand by my side holding up rainbow flags at pride parades? My true love needs to understand that sometimes I want to pray, and sometimes I want to party, and sometimes I don't want to hate myself for doing either or doing both. If the person I fall in love with is from another race, will I have to explain racism to them, or can I just give them Rennie ideologies while I'm no longer talking to white people about race and hope that they'll understand? If the person I love is from a different faith, will I have to argue my own God into existence? To find love, I need to be many different things. I need to be powerful, for being a Muslim woman and desiring is taboo. I need to be strong, for being queer and loving women may get me beaten up. For me to find love, I must wade through the homophobes and the Islamophobes and sexists and the racists, and then maybe I'll find someone who will stand beside me during protests and wipe my face when bigots spit on me. Some people are scared that spouting racism will get milkshake thrown on them. Me? I'm scared that loving someone and showing the world that I love them will get me killed. And in spite of it all, I'd still like to be a romantic. At 27, I'm not 27 anymore, this is a few years back, I still love talking about love and still find myself endlessly swiping left and occasionally right, and then chickening out before actually meeting anyone. I've downloaded, swiped, deleted, and re-downloaded so many dating apps that I could probably start a review site. But right now, love exhausts me. And ultimately, it's my mother's love that I come back to. The unconditional love for her family, her friends, and her work are what keeps me going. And like my mother, I have a lot of love to give. And I've now written and performed too many of my own poems about love and desire for love to just give up on me now. So despite the conditions and labels that other people may put on my love, I will always love. I will always look for it. And hopefully, one day, it will find me too.
Thank you, Afshan. That was a great way to end the panel. And thank you all. We will now take a break. I think we have about 7 minutes before we start the next panel, and we'll just set up. Do stay. It is a tribute to Keki Daruwala, and we have a series of readings by the Little Theatre, as well as Arundhati and Menka, who were here yesterday. So thank you both, Aditya and Afshan.